The wind rolled across the prairie like a living thing, bending the tall grass in waves that shimmered beneath the late afternoon sun. Ruby stood at the edge of her land, with her boots planted firm in the dirt, hands resting on her hips, as if daring the horizon itself to challenge her. This land wide, stubborn, and unforgiving had been fought for inch by inch, and now it was hers. At least, that's what the papers said. She still remembered the clerk's raised eyebrows when she filed the claim. "In your own name?" he'd asked, glancing around as if expecting a husband to appear from behind her skirts. "Yes," Ruby had replied, steady as stone. "In mine, now." Those papers were folded neatly inside her jacket, worn thin from being checked and rechecked. She'd heard the rumors, already whispers, that the claim would be contested, that the government didn't take kindly to women staking land alone. And that was why the man riding toward her homestead made her jaw tighten. The rider slowed. As he approached, his horse calm, almost careful. He dismounted without flourish, tying the reins to the hitching post like he expected to stay a while. The man was tall, lean, dressed plainly in dust-colored clothes. He carried a leather satchel instead of a gun belt, and his eyes moved over the land with quiet precision. "Ruby Hale?" he asked. "That depends," she said coolly. "Who's asking?" He hesitated, a fraction of a second. "Harold Finch, government surveyor." There it was. The challenge she'd been waiting for. "Well, Mr. Finch," Ruby said, stepping forward, "you're standing on my land." Harold nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that response. "That's what I'm here to determine." Ruby laughed, short and sharp. "Funny thing about that, I already determined it." Harold didn't smile. Instead, he opened his satchel and pulled out rolled maps, his fingers careful, respectful even. "Your claim is unusual. Filed without a husband, brother, or father attached. Washington wants it verified." "Verified or denied?" Ruby shot back. "Verified," he said, meeting her gaze. His eyes were calm, unreadable, if it holds. Ruby studied him. He didn't look like the kind of man who enjoyed proving people wrong. That somehow irritated her more. "You'll find everything in order," she said. "Cabin built, land cleared, crops planted. I've been here 3 years." "I'm aware," Harold replied. "That's what makes this complicated." They stood in silence for a moment, the wind threading between them. Ruby felt the familiar flare of defiance rise in her chest. She'd survived droughts, thieves, and loneliness, sharp enough to ache. She wasn't about to be undone by a man with maps and doubts. "You can measure all you like," she said, "but you won't scare me off." "I'm not here to scare you," Harold said quietly. "I'm here to see the truth." Something in his voice made her pause. It wasn't accusation. It wasn't condescension. It was curiosity. "Then you'd better stay," Ruby said. "Truth takes time." Harold nodded once. "So it does." As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the land Ruby had fought to claim, neither of them knew this survey would measure far more than boundaries. It would test pride, challenge conviction, and redraw lines neither of them expected. In the land silent, vast, and watching waited to decide who truly belonged. Morning came early on the prairie, ushered in by a pale sun and the restless cry of birds skimming the open sky. Ruby was already awake, stoking the fire and setting coffee to boil, when she heard Harold outside. His movements were quiet, deliberate, like a man who preferred not to announce himself. She stepped onto the porch with a tin cup in hand. "You always start work before breakfast." Harold looked up from his tripod and measuring chain. "Habit," he said. "Land looks different in the early light." Ruby followed his gaze. The grass shimmered silver with dew, the fields stretching wide and proud. "Looks the same to me, honest." He smiled faintly at that, the first crack she'd seen in his reserve. They worked side by side, without much talk at first. Harold paced distances, drove stakes into the soil, and scribbled notes with meticulous care. Ruby watched him from the corner of her eye while pretending to mend a fence. She didn't trust silence. It had a way of letting doubts creep in. You planning to find something wrong? She asked, eventually. Harold paused, wiping sweat from his brow. I'm planning to find what's there. That's government talk for trouble. He shook his head. It's just procedure. Ruby leaned against the fence. Procedure doesn't usually ride out this far, unless someone complained. It gave him pause. You may be right. So who was it? She pressed. The cattlemen south of here. They've wanted this land since before I built the cabin. Harold hesitated, then said carefully, I can't share names. Ruby's lips thinned. Of course you can't. As the sun climbed higher, tension settled between them like heat. Ruby noticed how Harold measured the land with almost reverence, as if he understood its moods. It unsettled her. She had expected arrogance or dismissal, not respect. By midday, she brought him bread and dried meat. He accepted with a nod. Thank you. You don't have to thank me for feeding a man who might take my home, she said. He met her eyes. I don't want to take anything from you. That's not your choice, Ruby replied. Harold exhaled slowly. You think I came here hoping you'd fail? She shrugged. Men usually do. The words hung heavy. Harold looked down at his maps, then back up. My mother tried to file a claim once. After my father died, Ruby stiffened. They turned her away, he continued. Said she didn't qualify. Ruby searched his face, seeing something raw beneath the calm. And now, you're the one holding the ruler. Yes, he said softly. And I don't intend to misuse it. The rest of the day passed differently after that. Ruby answered his questions more openly about when she arrived, how she marked her boundaries, how she survived the first winter alone. Harold listened, really listened, jotting notes, not just on paper, but somewhere deeper. As evening approached, Harold stopped short at the northern edge of the property. He knelt, brushing dirt aside near a half-buried marker. This stone, he said. Did you place it? My father did, Ruby replied, before he died. He taught me how to read land. Harold nodded, studying the marker. It aligns with the original survey lines. Ruby's heart skipped. So it supports your claim. She said nothing, afraid to hope too soon. That night, as the fire crackled between them and the prairie darkened into endless stars, Ruby realized something unsettling. Harold Finch wasn't her enemy, and that made everything far more complicated. The third day brought clouds heavy with promise. The sky stretched low and gray, as if pressing down on the land itself. Ruby felt the change in the air long before the first rumble of thunder. Storms always did. That made everything feel closer, more urgent. Harold noticed it too. We should finish the southern line before the rain hits, he said, folding his maps with care. Ruby nodded and grabbed her coat. Storm won't wait for government business. They worked faster, the wind tugging at Harold's papers, the grass bending sharply under sudden gusts. As they walked the boundary together, Ruby felt the weight of every step. This was the line that mattered most, the one the cattlemen had argued over for years. You ever wonder why they want this land so badly? She asked. Harold drove a stake into the soil. Water. Ruby smiled, without humor. Always is. Thunder cracked overhead, closer now. Harold straightened, studying the terrain. If your claim stands, it cuts off their access. That's why they say I don't belong, Ruby replied. Not because of paperwork, because I'm in the way. Rain began to fall in sharp, sudden drops. They hurried toward the creek, where the boundary curved with the land. The water rushed fast and brown from recent storms. Harold crouched, checking measurements against his notes, his brow furrowed. This is where the dispute lies. Ruby's chest tightened, meaning the original map is unclear. The creek may have shifted over the years. Land moves, Ruby said firmly. People just don't like admitting it. Another crack of thunder forced Harold to look up. If the creek moved, the boundary moves with it. Ruby stared at him. So, my land shrinks, for grows, he said honestly. They locked eyes as rain soaked them both. Ruby's anger flared. You tell them it moved the wrong way, and I lose everything. I tell them the truth, Harold said, raising his voice over the storm. "And who decides what that is?" she demanded. Lightning split the sky, and for a moment everything was white and sharp. Harold took a step closer. Truth isn't always clean, but it matters. The rain worsened, forcing them to seek shelter beneath a rocky overhang near the creek. They stood close, breath visible in the cool air, the storm roaring around them. Ruby laughed suddenly, bitter and breathless. "Funny thing. I thought fighting would be louder." Harold glanced at her. "This is loud enough." She looked at him. Then not as a surveyor, not as a threat, but as a man carrying his own ghosts. "Why do you care so much?" He hesitated, then spoke. "Because once someone measured my mother out of her life." The words settled between them, heavy and unspoken. Before Ruby felt something soften in her chest. When the rain eased, Harold stepped back toward the creek. He studied the bank closely, tracing erosion lines, old roots exposed by shifting soil. "There," he said, pointing that bend. "It's recent." Ruby followed his gaze. "Meaning the creek moved south." "Yes," Harold said slowly, "which means—" Ruby's breath caught. "The land I've been working is still mine." Harold nodded. According to the rules, she let out a shaky breath, relief mixing with something deeper, gratitude, maybe trust. As the storm passed and sunlight broke through the clouds, Ruby realized the proof she'd feared most wasn't the land itself. It was the proof of who Harold Finch truly was, and what he was willing to stand for. The storm left, the land rinsed clean, the air sharp and bright the next morning. Sunlight caught in every blade of grass, and the creek ran quieter now, as if satisfied after having made its point. Ruby stood on her porch, watching Harold pack his tools with practiced care. There was a finality to his movements that set her on edge. "You're finishing today," she said. Harold glanced up. "Yes, I have enough to file my report." Ruby crossed her arms. "And once you ride out, that report decides everything." He didn't deny it. "It carries weight." She walked toward him, boots crunching softly over gravel. "You could still write it any way you choose." Harold met her gaze, steady as ever. "I won't." They spent the morning revisiting key marker stones, trees, notches cut by hands, long gone. Ruby found herself telling him stories she hadn't planned to share. How her father taught her to read the stars. How her mother kept a garden even when the soil fought back. How she'd buried both of them on a rise overlooking the creek. "The land remembers," she said quietly, as they stood near the graves. "Even when people don't." Harold removed his hat. "It does." At midday, a rider appeared on the southern ridge. Then another. Ruby's stomach dropped. "They've come," she said. "The cattlemen." Harold followed her gaze. "I expected as much." 3 men rode in, dust trailing behind them. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a hard smile, tipped his hat at Harold, but barely looked at Ruby. "You, the surveyor?" he asked. "Yes," Harold replied. "Good. Then you'll see this claim's a mistake." Ruby stepped forward. "You don't get to decide that." The man laughed. "A woman doesn't get land like this alone." Harold's jaw tightened. "She does, if the law allows it." The leader's smile faded. "Law can be flexible." Ruby felt the familiar burn of anger, but before she could speak, Harold did. "I've completed my measurements," he said calmly. "The boundaries hold. Her claim is valid." Silence fell like a dropped stone. The man sneered. "You sure about that?" "I am," Harold said, "and my report will reflect it." The riders exchanged looks. One spat into the dirt. "You're making enemies, Finch." Harold didn't flinch. "I'm doing my job." The men rode off, their threat hanging in the air long after they disappeared. Ruby exhaled slowly. "They won't forget this." "Neither will I," Harold said. That evening, Ruby cooked a proper meal: beans, fresh bread, the last of her dried apples. They ate by firelight, the quiet between them no longer sharp but thoughtful. "You could have played it safe," Ruby said. "No one would have blamed you." Harold stared into the flames. "I would have." She studied him, seeing resolve etched deep. "What will you do next?" "File the report," he said. Then move on. The words landed heavier than she expected. You belong here, she said, before she could stop herself. Harold looked at her then. Really looked. So do you. The fire popped, sending sparks into the dark. Ruby realized the land wasn't the only thing being claimed. It was her heart, quietly, steadily by. A man who measured truth more carefully than lines on a map. Dawn arrived softly, as if the land itself were reluctant to disturb the stillness. A thin mist clung to the grass, and the horizon glowed pale gold. Ruby stood near the creek, watching the water move steady, unyielding, certain of its course. For the first time in days, her chest didn't feel tight with waiting. Behind her, she heard footsteps. You're up early, Harold said. Couldn't sleep, Ruby replied. Too much writing on paper and ink. Harold joined her at the creek's edge. His satchel was packed, maps rolled tight, his horse already saddled. The sight of it sent a quiet ache through her. I'll ride straight to town, he said. File the report today. And then, she asked. And then, he said carefully, the claim becomes official. No more disputes. Ruby nodded. She should have felt victorious. Instead, she felt exposed, like someone who'd braced for a storm, only to find clear skies and didn't know what to do with the calm. You saved my land, she said finally. Harold shook his head. I didn't save it. You proved it was yours. They stood in silence, the creek murmuring between them. Ruby thought of all the nights she'd stood alone, defending this place with nothing but stubborn hope. She hadn't planned on sharing the victory. You could stay, she said suddenly. For a while, Harold looked surprised. I have work elsewhere. Work always goes elsewhere, Ruby replied. He studied her face, searching for something certainty. Maybe. You don't need anyone to stand for you anymore. I never said I needed, she said. I said you could. Harold smiled then, slow and genuine. That may be the strongest invitation I've ever heard. They walked back, toward the cabin together. Near the porch, Harold stopped and pulled one last document from his satchel. This is a copy, he said, handing it to her. My measurements, my conclusions. Ruby took it with careful hands. You're sure? I am, he said firmly. This land is yours. By law, by labor, by right. Emotion welled unexpectedly. Ruby swallowed hard. Thank you, he tipped his hat, for trusting me. They shared a quiet moment, one that felt bigger than words. Then Harold mounted his horse. I don't know what comes next, he said. Ruby smiled. Neither do I, but the land will tell us. Harold nodded once, then turned his horse toward the open trail. He rode slowly at first, then steadier, until he became a small figure against the wide prairie. Ruby watched until he disappeared. Days passed, then weeks. One afternoon, a letter arrived from town officials stamped, undeniable. Her claim was approved. Final, the land was hers, without condition. That same evening, another rider appeared on the ridge. Ruby stepped onto the porch, heart pounding. Harold dismounted, dust-covered, smiling like a man who'd found his way home. I filed the report, he said. Then I resigned. Ruby blinked. You did what? I decided I was tired of measuring other people's lives, he said. I'd rather help build one. She crossed the distance between them. You're serious. As the land, he replied. Ruby laughed, breathless and free. Then you'd better learn how to work hard. Harold smiled. I already have. As the sun dipped low and the land stretched wide and certain around them, Ruby knew this claim. This life would hold. And if you enjoyed this Western love story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more Western stories.